For most of our lives, we've treated water as something infinite. It just falls from the sky, flows from our taps. But a quiet revolution has been happening right under our noses. A global campaign to turn the world's most essential resource into a source of private profit. So today, in this special investigation, we're going to follow the money to find out who is trying to control the world's water.
Okay, let's just start right here. See, that quote used to sound like some wild prediction about a distant future. But today, it's just a plain statement of fact. For a really powerful group of corporations and Wall Street banks, water is no longer a human right or a public good. It's become blue gold, a commodity to be bought, sold, and speculated on for, well, enormous profit. This is the story of exactly how that happened.
All right, so here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll look at the big idea that turned water into a product in the first place. Then, we'll expose the global playbook used to take over public systems around the world. We'll see what happened when people fought back in a dramatic showdown in Bolivia. Then we'll check in on a 30-year experiment in the UK. And finally, we're going to uncover the new frontier of water speculation on Wall Street before asking the most important question of all, who should really control the tap? So let's start with that first big question. How in the world did we get here? Well, it all started with a fundamental change in thinking. For most of human history, water was seen as a shared public resource. The goal was simple, access for everybody. But then a new philosophy started to take hold, one that argued the only way to manage water was to put a price on it and hand control over to private companies. And here's the kicker. This shift, it didn't just happen by accident. It wasn't a series of random events. It was a deliberate, highly coordinated strategy, rolled out over decades by some of the most powerful financial institutions and corporations on the planet. They saw multi-billion-dollar opportunity, and they built a whole system from the ground up to capture it. So, how did this global takeover actually work? That brings us to Section 2, the global playbook. And to understand it, you really have to look at the 1990s. That decade was the pivotal moment, a period of just explosive growth for a handful of companies that were dead set on becoming the world's new water barons. Get this. In 1990, only about 51 million people in a dozen countries got their water from a private company. But by 2002, just 12 years later, that number had exploded to over 300 million people in 56 countries. That's a nearly 500% jump. Now, that kind of growth isn't organic. It was engineered, and a key architect was the World Bank, which basically used its financial muscle to force developing nations to sell off their public water systems if they wanted to get critical loans.
And if you want to know why this all happened so fast, well, this one number tells you everything you need to know. 9,786%. That's how much the German utility giant RWE saw its water revenue grow after it bought Britain's Thames Water. Let's be clear, this was never about improving service. This was about turning a public necessity into a cash machine for shareholders.
So who was calling the shots? Researchers have a name for them, a global high command for water. At the very top, you had the big guns, the World Bank and the IMF, creating the financial pressure. Then you had the corporate giants, mainly Suez and Vivendi from France and Thames Water from the UK, ready to swoop in and lock down these incredibly lucrative, long-term contracts. And to make it all seem legit, they funded a whole network of think tanks and conferences to push one single message, that privatization wasn't just an option, it was the only solution.
So that's the high-level playbook. But what does it actually look like when it hits the ground, in real people's lives? For that, we have to go to Cochabamba, Bolivia, a city that became a global symbol of resistance in what would become known, literally, as the Water War.
So following the World Bank script perfectly, the Bolivian government handed over control of Cochabamba's water to a private group called Aguas del Tunari. And the main foreign partner in this deal was Bechtel, a huge U.S. engineering firm. The deal was signed, and the stage was set for a massive conflict. The impact was immediate, and it was brutal. The new company jacked up water rates instantly, by as much as 150%. Now think about this. For families earning minimum wage, their water bill suddenly ate up a quarter of their entire monthly income. People were facing an impossible choice: pay for water or pay for food. This wasn't just a price increase, it was a threat to their survival. So what happened next? The people of Cochabamba rose up. For months, the entire city was shut down by massive protests and blockades. The government declared a state of emergency and sent in the police. In the end, amazingly, the people won. The government was forced to tear up the contract and give the water system back to the public. But that victory came at a terrible cost.
6 people were killed, and hundreds more were injured.
So Cochabamba shows you the explosion. But what about the slow burn? What happens when this model plays out not for months, but for decades in a wealthy, developed nation? For that, we turn to the United Kingdom, which privatized its entire water system back in 1989. Now, after more than 30 years, the results are in.
So, who actually owns England's water today? Well, here's the surprising answer. More than 70% of it isn't even owned by British entities anymore. We're talking about a tangled web of private equity firms, international banks, and even sovereign wealth funds from places like China, Abu Dhabi, and Singapore. A critical piece of national infrastructure is now controlled by distant financial players whose only real job is to make a profit for their investors, not the British communities they're supposed to be serving.
You know, the whole sales pitch for privatization was that private companies would be more efficient, that they'd invest more. But does the data actually back that up? Well, we can look right next door, to Scotland, where water is still publicly owned. And it turns out, public Scottish Water has invested 35% more per household than the private English companies. And that gets to the heart of it. The public model puts money back into the system, while the private model is designed to pull money out.
Let's just lay out the final scorecard here. The English water companies were sold off completely debt-free, a clean slate. Today, they are buried under £54 billion of debt. So where did all the money go? Well, an average of £2.1 billion a year has been paid out in dividends to shareholders. Every single year. Meanwhile, investment in the actual pipes and treatment plants has gone down. And the result of all this? Failing systems that are now routinely dumping raw sewage into the country's rivers and onto its beaches.
But the story doesn't stop with just owning the pipes. The model is evolving into something else entirely. It's no longer just about running utility for profit. No, the new frontier is the financialization of water itself, turning water into a purely speculative asset, just like trading oil or gold.
Now let's be really clear about what this means, because it's a game changer. Financialization completely disconnects water from its use in the real world. These investors, they aren't interested in growing food or supplying cities. They are betting on scarcity. They buy up water rights for one reason and one reason only, to hold on to them until a crisis, like a massive drought, makes their value explode.
So here's how the playbook works. It's a 4-step plan. First, an investment fund buys up huge farms, not for the land, but for the water rights that come with it. Second, they have to get around use it or lose it laws, which are designed to stop hoarding. So they just lease the water for cheap to local farmers. It's a neat little legal loophole. Third, they wait. They just hold the asset as climate change makes droughts worse and worse. And finally, when a city is desperate, they sell those rights to the highest bidder for a colossal profit.
And this really gets to the heart of it. The goal is no longer to manage a resource for the public good. The goal is to profit from distress. For this new class of water barons, a drought isn't a natural disaster to be solved. It's a market signal that their investment is about to pay off, big time.
So who are these new water barons? Well, the list includes Wall Street giants you've definitely heard of, like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan Chase. It includes specialized investment firms like Australia's Macquarie Bank and billionaire tycoons like the late T. Boone Pickens, who quietly bought up massive amounts of water rights in Texas. They are the new, invisible landlords of our most vital resource.
Okay, so we've seen the global playbook, we've seen the human cost in the streets of Bolivia, and now we're seeing the financial endgame on Wall Street. It all boils down to one fundamental thing: power. Who has it and who gets to decide?
So let's just recap the real cost of this model. First, your bills go up. The data shows that, on average, private utilities charge households up to 59% more. Second, accountability goes out the window. Decisions are no longer made by local officials you can vote for, but by executives in a boardroom halfway around the world. Third, the entire mission changes. It's no longer about public need, it's about shareholder returns. And finally, the most basic human right to water is put at risk when it's treated as just another line item on a balance sheet.
You know, from the public fountains of ancient Rome all the way to the huge utility networks we have today, societies have always understood a simple truth. Control over water is control over life itself. As corporations and Wall Street funds now try to consolidate that control, the stakes just could not be higher. And it leaves us with maybe the most important question of all. If water is life, who should be allowed to own it?
So while markets rise and fall, systems like this quietly move billions behind the scenes, hidden from the public, hidden from scrutiny, and sometimes hidden from the law itself. Because in global finance, The most powerful forces are rarely the most visible. And this is just one of the systems used by the unseen elite.